Ladies and gentlemen, the Taiwan Strait remains one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. While many envision a military conflict between China and Taiwan, Beijing has an alternative strategy, one that could bring Taiwan under its control without a single shot being fired. A full-scale military invasion of Taiwan would be one of the most complex and dangerous military operations in modern history. The Taiwan Strait, a 100-mile wide body of water separating China from Taiwan, presents a natural defensive barrier that makes any amphibious assault a logistical nightmare. Unlike other military operations China has undertaken, Taiwan is heavily fortified, equipped with advanced missile defense systems, and has a well-trained military prepared for asymmetric warfare. Any direct invasion would require China to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops, naval forces, and air power while also neutralizing Taiwan's defense capabilities. This would be an immense challenge, even for the world's largest standing army. Beyond the tactical difficulties, an invasion would be economically catastrophic for China. Taiwan is a critical hub for the global semiconductor industry, producing over 60% of the world's semiconductors and 90% of the most advanced chips. A war would disrupt this industry, leading to economic fallout not just for China, but for the entire world. The global supply chain crisis caused by a conflict in Taiwan would cripple China's own economy, which relies on Taiwan's chips for manufacturing, technology, and military advancements. The economic blowback from an invasion could set China back decades in its quest for global dominance. Furthermore, a military attack on Taiwan would almost certainly draw in international intervention. The United States has a long-standing commitment to Taiwan's security under the Taiwan Relations Act, and while it does not explicitly guarantee military intervention, the U.S. has sent strong signals that it would support Taiwan in the event of an attack. Japan, Australia, and other regional allies may also get involved, turning a Taiwan invasion into a large-scale conflict that could destabilize the entire Indo-Pacific region. Such a war would not only drain China's military and economic resources, but could also result in severe sanctions from Western nations, similar to what Russia has faced after its invasion of Ukraine. China's leadership, under Xi Jinping, has demonstrated a long-term strategic approach rather than reckless aggression. Unlike Russia's direct and brutal invasion of Ukraine, China prefers a more calculated and patient strategy. Xi understands that controlling Taiwan is not just a matter of military force, but of ensuring that China's rise as a global superpower remains uninterrupted. If China were to launch an invasion and fail, or even succeed at a high cost, it could spark internal instability, public dissent, and economic decline, all of which could threaten the Communist Party's grip on power. Given these risks, China is more likely to pursue a long-term strategy that avoids direct military confrontation. Instead of an invasion, China is investing in economic coercion, political influence, cyber warfare, and diplomatic pressure to weaken Taiwan's resistance. By applying these tactics strategically over time, China can erode Taiwan's sovereignty without triggering a costly and unpredictable war. This method allows Beijing to maintain stability while gradually bringing Taiwan under its sphere of influence, achieving its objectives without the destructive consequences of war. Taiwan's economy is deeply intertwined with China's, making economic dependence one of Beijing's most powerful tools for exerting control over the island. China is Taiwan's largest trading partner, accounting for over 40% of its exports and a significant portion of its imports. Taiwanese businesses, particularly in manufacturing and electronics, rely heavily on access to China's massive consumer market and supply chains. This economic interconnection gives Beijing substantial leverage over Taiwan's financial stability and long-term growth prospects. One of the most effective ways China could use economic pressure is by restricting trade or imposing targeted sanctions on key Taiwanese industries. In recent years, China has already experimented with economic coercion by banning imports of Taiwanese pineapples, fish, and other agricultural products. While these moves may seem small, they send a clear message: China can disrupt Taiwan's economy at will. If Beijing were to escalate these tactics by blocking critical exports, such as semiconductors or industrial components, it could cause severe economic strain on Taiwan's businesses, forcing many to consider closer ties with China as a means of survival. Moreover, China's influence extends beyond direct trade. Many Taiwanese companies operate factories and supply chains in China, employing millions of workers. These companies depend on the stability of cross-strait relations, and any disruption could lead to significant financial losses. By selectively tightening regulations, increasing tariffs, or even nationalizing Taiwanese-owned assets in China, Beijing could create a hostile environment that pressures business leaders to support policies favoring closer integration with the mainland. Investment is another critical aspect of Taiwan's economic dependence. Chinese investors, both state-backed and private, have poured billions into Taiwanese businesses, particularly in real estate, tourism, and technology sectors. By controlling large portions of Taiwan's financial and real estate markets, China can manipulate economic conditions to create instability or offer incentives for cooperation. If Taiwan's economy were to face a prolonged downturn due to external pressure from China, the Taiwanese government could be forced to negotiate economic agreements that gradually align it more closely with Beijing's policies. China also has the ability to manipulate Taiwan's economy by influencing global supply chains. Given China's dominance in manufacturing and exports, it could apply indirect pressure on multinational corporations operating in Taiwan. If major companies begin seeing Taiwan as a risky investment due to Chinese pressure, they may relocate operations to other regions, weakening Taiwan's economy further. This would create an environment where Taiwan becomes increasingly reliant on China for trade, investment, and economic stability, making integration seem like a pragmatic choice rather than a forced decision. The economic aspect of China's strategy is particularly effective because it doesn't require military action or direct confrontation. Instead, it operates in the background, gradually shifting Taiwan's economic reality until the cost of resisting unification becomes too high. Over time, as businesses, workers, and policymakers feel the economic squeeze, Beijing can present itself as the solution rather than the source of the problem. This slow but strategic process could ultimately achieve what military force cannot, bringing Taiwan under Beijing's influence without triggering international intervention. China understands that controlling Taiwan is not just a military or economic battle, it is also a psychological and political struggle. One of Beijing's most effective strategies is to weaken Taiwan's internal unity by fostering political divisions, spreading disinformation, and influencing public opinion. If China can create an environment where the Taiwanese people themselves are divided over their island's future, resistance to Beijing's influence will be significantly weakened. Taiwan has a vibrant democracy with multiple political parties, the two major ones being the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, which supports Taiwan's independence, and the Kuomintang, KMT, which has historically favored closer ties with China. Beijing exploits these political divisions by supporting politicians and parties that advocate for better relations with the mainland. Through financial incentives, diplomatic support, and media influence, China attempts to shift Taiwan's political landscape in favor of pro-unification forces. One of Beijing's primary tools in this effort is disinformation and propaganda. China has invested heavily in media operations aimed at shaping narratives within Taiwan. Through social media platforms, news networks, and online forums, Beijing spreads misleading information designed to undermine confidence in Taiwan's government, exaggerate economic and military threats, and create distrust among citizens. By making Taiwanese people feel vulnerable and divided, China reduces the population's willingness to resist unification efforts. A key example of this strategy is the use of cyber propaganda and fake news. Chinese state-backed actors frequently flood Taiwanese social media with stories portraying Taiwan's leadership as weak or corrupt. False claims about Taiwan's economy collapsing, fabricated stories about U.S. abandonment, and exaggerated narratives about Taiwan's military vulnerabilities are all designed to erode public confidence. The goal is to create internal doubts about Taiwan's ability to stand independently, making unification with China seem like a reasonable or even inevitable outcome. Beyond propaganda, China also works to manipulate Taiwan's elite and business leaders. Many influential Taiwanese business figures have strong financial ties to China, making them susceptible to Beijing's influence. China uses a combination of financial incentives, coercion, and diplomatic pressure to turn these individuals into advocates for better cross-strait relations. If enough influential figures in Taiwan begin pushing for engagement with China, public perception can gradually shift in Beijing's favor. Another tactic Beijing employs is social and cultural integration. Over the years, China has increased tourism, academic exchanges, and business opportunities between the mainland and Taiwan. Many Taiwanese students and professionals work or study in China, where they're exposed to pro-unification narratives. By fostering personal and economic connections, China seeks to blur the distinction between Taiwanese and Chinese identities, making eventual integration appear less threatening. Beijing also leverages psychological warfare through military posturing and diplomatic isolation. By continuously flying military jets near Taiwan, conducting naval exercises, and warning of the consequences of independence, China creates an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. If the Taiwanese public begins to feel that their government cannot guarantee their safety, some may start seeing unification as a way to avoid a future conflict. At the same time, China ensures that Taiwan remains diplomatically isolated. By pressuring countries to sever ties with Taiwan and blocking its participation in international organizations, Beijing reinforces the idea that Taiwan cannot survive without China's support. The psychological impact of diplomatic isolation weakens morale within Taiwan, making unification seem like a path to stability rather than subjugation. By combining political manipulation, propaganda, economic coercion, and psychological tactics, China aims to divide Taiwan from within. If Taiwan's citizens lose confidence in their government, become economically dependent on China, and are constantly exposed to pro-unification narratives, Beijing could achieve its goal without needing to fire a single shot. China has long pursued a strategy of isolating Taiwan diplomatically, making it increasingly difficult for the island to maintain official recognition on the global stage. By pressuring countries, international organizations, and corporations to sever ties with Taiwan, Beijing aims to create a situation where Taiwan is seen as an isolated entity with no viable path to independence. If Taiwan is left without allies, its ability to resist Chinese influence will weaken over time, making unification seem like the only practical option. One of the most visible aspects of China's diplomatic strategy is its campaign to strip Taiwan of formal diplomatic recognition. Since the United Nations recognized the People's Republic of China, PRC, as the legitimate representative of China in 1971, Taiwan has been gradually pushed out of most international institutions. Today, only a handful of small nations, mostly in Latin America, the Pacific, and the Caribbean, still recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state. China has aggressively used economic incentives, infrastructure deals, and financial aid to convince these countries to switch their allegiance from Taiwan to Beijing. Each time a country breaks diplomatic ties with Taiwan, it sends a powerful message that the island is losing global support. Beyond direct diplomatic pressure, China blocks Taiwan's participation in international organizations. Taiwan is not allowed to be a member of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, WHO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, or other major global bodies. Even in situations where Taiwan's participation would be beneficial, such as pandemic response efforts, China ensures that Taiwan remains excluded. By keeping Taiwan out of these institutions, Beijing reinforces the perception that Taiwan is not a legitimate country and must eventually reunite with the mainland. China also pressures multinational corporations and global businesses to comply with its position on Taiwan. Many international companies have been forced to refer to Taiwan as a province of China on their websites, maps, and official documents under the threat of being banned from the Chinese market. Airlines, fashion brands, and even technology firms have all had to issue apologies and correct their language after facing backlash from Chinese authorities. This corporate pressure serves as a constant reminder that any acknowledgement of Taiwan's sovereignty comes with economic consequences, discouraging companies from engaging with Taiwan as an independent entity. In addition, China uses economic and political leverage over major global powers to prevent them from strengthening ties with Taiwan. Even countries that do not recognize Taiwan diplomatically, such as the United States, Japan, and European nations, face pressure whenever they engage with Taiwanese leaders. Every time a US or European official visits Taiwan or expresses support for the island, China responds with diplomatic protests, military posturing, or economic retaliation. The goal is to make supporting Taiwan as costly and inconvenient as possible, discouraging even unofficial engagement. China's diplomatic strategy also involves influencing international narratives about Taiwan. Through its state-controlled media, educational partnerships, and soft power initiatives, Beijing promotes the idea that Taiwan is an inseparable part of China. Chinese diplomats consistently push this narrative in the United Nations and other global forums, ensuring that Taiwan's claims to independence are dismissed as illegitimate. By controlling the global conversation, China limits Taiwan's ability to argue its case on the world stage. As Taiwan becomes more isolated, its psychological resilience weakens. If the Taiwanese people feel abandoned by the international community, they may begin to question whether resisting China is worthwhile. Without diplomatic allies, Taiwan's government may struggle to negotiate trade agreements, join international initiatives, or even maintain a sense of national legitimacy. Over time, the lack of global recognition could push Taiwan toward accepting Beijing's terms for unification, not because of direct military pressure, but because it sees no viable alternative. In the modern era, warfare is no longer limited to physical battlefields. Instead, cyberspace has become a crucial front in geopolitical conflicts, and China has been using cyber warfare as a key tool to weaken Taiwan's government, disrupt its economy, and undermine public trust. If Beijing can successfully destabilize Taiwan through cyber attacks, it can create internal chaos, making the island more vulnerable to political pressure and ultimately paving the way for a peaceful takeover. China has one of the world's most advanced cyber warfare capabilities, with state-sponsored hacking groups that have targeted governments, businesses, and infrastructure worldwide. Taiwan, as China's primary geopolitical target, has been on the receiving end of relentless cyber attacks for years. These attacks range from stealing sensitive government information to disrupting public services and spreading disinformation. By constantly attacking Taiwan's digital infrastructure, China aims to create an atmosphere of instability, making it harder for the government to function effectively. One of the most dangerous aspects of cyber warfare is its ability to cripple critical infrastructure. Taiwan's power grid, banking system, transportation networks, and healthcare services all rely on digital systems that can be compromised by cyber attacks. If China were to launch a large-scale cyber offensive, it could shut down major parts of Taiwan's infrastructure, causing widespread panic and economic damage. Imagine a scenario where Taiwan's banking system is frozen, power outages occur across major cities, and government communications are disrupted. Such an attack wouldn't just cause inconvenience. It would shake public confidence in the government's ability to maintain stability, making people more open to the idea of closer cooperation with Beijing. China has already tested these tactics on a smaller scale. Over the years, Taiwan has experienced multiple cyber attacks aimed at disrupting government operations. For example, during Taiwanese elections, cyber attacks have targeted voter registration databases and government websites, attempting to sow confusion and distrust in the democratic process. By interfering with elections and creating doubts about their legitimacy, China hopes to weaken Taiwan's democratic institutions, making authoritarian rule seem like a more stable alternative. Beyond direct cyber attacks, China also engages in cyber-enabled psychological warfare. Through social media manipulation, Chinese hackers and state-sponsored trolls spread disinformation designed to divide Taiwanese society. They create fake social media accounts to stir up political debates, amplify extremist views, and spread conspiracy theories that make Taiwanese citizens lose trust in their government. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Chinese cyber operatives spread false rumors about Taiwan's healthcare system failing, attempting to create fear and uncertainty. If Taiwan citizens begin doubting their own government's ability to protect them, Beijing's influence over public opinion grows stronger. Cyber warfare also allows China to target Taiwan's military and security systems. Modern military operations rely heavily on digital networks, from communication systems to missile defense platforms. A well-coordinated cyber attack could disrupt Taiwan's ability to respond to military threats, leaving it vulnerable in a crisis. If Taiwan's defense systems were hacked or disabled in the middle of a conflict, it could force Taiwanese leaders to surrender without ever engaging in traditional warfare. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of cyber warfare is that it is difficult to detect and attribute. Unlike traditional military attacks, cyber warfare operates in the shadows, making it hard for Taiwan to prove that China is behind certain incidents. This allows Beijing to keep up constant pressure on Taiwan without triggering a direct military response from the US or other allies. By using cyber attacks as a silent weapon, China can weaken Taiwan from within, ensuring that when the time comes for unification, resistance will be minimal. China has mastered the art of information warfare, using disinformation as a powerful tool to shape public opinion, divide societies, and weaken governments. In Taiwan, where democracy allows for a free exchange of ideas, Beijing exploits this openness by flooding the information space with misleading narratives, false stories, and propaganda designed to undermine confidence in the government and create divisions among the people. If China can successfully manipulate public perception, it can erode resistance to unification, making the process seem like a logical or even necessary outcome. One of the main ways China spreads disinformation in Taiwan is through social media manipulation. Chinese state-sponsored groups operate thousands of fake accounts on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and local Taiwanese forums. These accounts are programmed to spread false or exaggerated stories about Taiwan's economy, military capabilities, and political stability. For example, during Taiwan's 2020 presidential election, Chinese-backed accounts circulated fake news about voter fraud, corruption scandals, and supposed American abandonment of Taiwan. These tactics were designed to confuse the public, discredit the pro-independence leadership, and boost support for candidates who favored closer ties with China. China also uses fake news websites and media outlets to spread its narratives. Beijing funds and controls certain Taiwanese news platforms, radio stations, and online blogs that subtly push pro-China messaging while disguising it as independent journalism. These outlets publish misleading stories about Taiwan's economic struggles, the benefits of reunification, and the dangers of opposing China. By doing so, China can create an illusion of internal debate, making it seem like a growing number of Taiwanese citizens support unification when, in reality, the messaging is being driven by foreign influence. Another effective disinformation tactic involves deepfake technology and manipulated videos. In recent years, advances in artificial intelligence have allowed China to create highly realistic videos that can spread false narratives. For example, deepfake videos can be used to make it appear as though a Taiwanese politician is secretly conspiring with foreign governments, engaging in corruption, or making controversial statements that harm public trust. If the public begins to believe these false narratives, confidence in democratic institutions could erode, making Taiwan more susceptible to Beijing's influence. China's disinformation strategy also includes spreading fear and uncertainty about Taiwan's future. Stories about Taiwan being abandoned by the US, facing an imminent economic collapse, or being unable to defend itself in a military conflict are frequently circulated to weaken public morale. By convincing Taiwanese citizens that their future is bleak without China's support, Beijing hopes to make unification seem like the only viable path forward. In addition to direct disinformation, China manipulates education and cultural exchanges to subtly push its narratives. Beijing funds Confucius institutes and academic programs in Taiwan that promote a pro-China version of history. Through scholarships, exchange programs, and business incentives, China attempts to win over Taiwan's younger generations, making them more open to the idea of reunification. If young Taiwanese students grow up exposed to Chinese narratives about shared history and economic prosperity under Beijing's leadership, resistance to unification could gradually fade over time. Perhaps one of the most dangerous effects of China's disinformation campaign is its ability to create internal divisions within Taiwan. By amplifying political, social, and generational differences, China fosters an environment where Taiwanese people are too busy fighting among themselves to unite against external threats. Beijing funds and promotes radical voices on both the pro-independence and pro-unification sides, creating an artificial polarization that weakens Taiwan's internal cohesion. If Taiwan becomes too divided to present a united front, Beijing's goal of peaceful absorption becomes much easier to achieve. China understands that a direct military invasion of Taiwan would be costly and risky, so instead of forcefully taking over the island, it is working to infiltrate Taiwan's political system from within. By strategically influencing politicians, funding pro-Beijing parties, and placing loyalists in key positions, China aims to gradually shift Taiwan's policies in its favor. If Beijing can get Taiwan's own government to pass laws that favor China, weaken pro-independence movements, and erode resistance to unification, it can achieve its long-term goal without ever firing a shot. One of the most effective ways China infiltrates Taiwan's political system is through financial influence over politicians. Many Taiwanese politicians, especially those from parties that support better relations with China, receive direct or indirect funding from Chinese businesses and organizations. China's government and state-affiliated companies provide donations, business deals, and even hidden bribes to pro-Beijing politicians, ensuring that they push policies that align with China's interests. If China can place enough of these politicians in Taiwan's government, it can slowly shift the country's political direction toward unification. Beyond individual politicians, China also supports entire political parties that favor closer ties with Beijing. The Kuomintang, KMT, Taiwan's main opposition party, has historically maintained a friendlier stance toward China compared to the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, which strongly supports Taiwan's independence. China encourages the success of pro-unification parties by providing financial backing, diplomatic support, and media promotion. During Taiwanese elections, China uses cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and economic pressure to influence the outcome in favor of candidates who align with its interests. If Beijing can ensure that a pro-China government comes to power in Taiwan, it can push policies that gradually integrate the island with the mainland. China also works to infiltrate Taiwan's local governments and administrative bodies. While national elections attract the most attention, local government officials control many important aspects of Taiwan's economy, education system, and public policy. By placing pro-China figures in city councils, mayoral offices, and provincial governments, Beijing can influence decision-making at the grassroots level. Local leaders with pro-Beijing leanings can approve infrastructure projects with Chinese investment, support Chinese educational initiatives, and allow greater business integration with the mainland, all of which bring Taiwan closer to China's sphere of influence. Another key strategy is controlling Taiwan's business elite and economic decision-makers. Many of Taiwan's wealthiest business leaders have major financial ties to China, and Beijing uses this economic leverage to shape political decisions. If Chinese-backed Taiwanese businesses support certain candidates or push for specific policies, it can shift the political landscape in Beijing's favor. By ensuring that Taiwan's economy remains deeply connected to China, Beijing makes it increasingly difficult for the government to take a strong pro-independent stance without facing economic consequences. China's infiltration efforts also extend to Taiwan's intelligence agencies and military institutions. Beijing has been caught attempting to recruit Taiwanese officials, military officers, and government insiders to act as informants or even saboteurs. Chinese intelligence agencies use bribery, blackmail, and ideological persuasion to turn individuals within Taiwan's government into assets for Beijing. If China can gather sensitive intelligence, disrupt military planning, or even place sympathizers in key defense positions, it could weaken Taiwan's ability to resist a future takeover. China also seeks to manipulate Taiwan's judicial system and legal framework. Through influence over lawmakers, Beijing can encourage the passage of laws that weaken Taiwan's ability to resist Chinese influence. This could include laws that allow for greater economic integration with China, restrictions on foreign political interference, which could be used to limit U.S. or Western support, or legal reforms that make it easier for China to expand its media and cultural influence in Taiwan. If Taiwan's own legal system starts working in Beijing's favor, resistance to unification becomes increasingly difficult. Perhaps one of the most dangerous aspects of China's political infiltration strategy is its ability to create a slow, almost unnoticed shift in Taiwan's policies. Instead of forcing sudden changes, China's influence works gradually over years and even decades. Each small political decision, economic partnership, or legal reform may seem insignificant on its own, but when combined, they form a larger strategy that brings Taiwan closer to China's control. If Beijing succeeds in embedding enough of its influence within Taiwan's government, it may eventually reach a point where Taiwan's political leadership itself begins advocating for unification, not because of military threats, but because they believe it is the best or only option. Economic dependence on China could make resistance seem impractical. One of the most powerful tools China has at its disposal is economic leverage. By making Taiwan increasingly dependent on trade, investment, and financial ties with the mainland, China can gradually erode Taiwan's ability to resist political pressure. If Taiwan's economy becomes deeply intertwined with China's, any attempt to push back against Beijing's influence could come at a devastating cost, making unification seem like the most practical solution. Taiwan's economy is already heavily linked to China's. As of recent years, China is Taiwan's largest trading partner, accounting for a significant portion of the island's exports and imports. Taiwanese businesses rely on access to China's massive consumer market, supply chains, and manufacturing networks. Many of Taiwan's top companies, including major technology firms, have factories and operations in China. If Beijing decided to impose economic restrictions or sanctions, it could severely damage Taiwan's economy, putting pressure on businesses and the government to comply with China's demands. One way China exerts economic control over Taiwan is through strategic trade policies. Beijing has the ability to offer preferential trade agreements, lower tariffs, and special economic incentives to Taiwanese businesses that align with its interests. At the same time, it can impose restrictions on industries that support Taiwan's independence movement. By selectively rewarding and punishing different sectors of Taiwan's economy, China can manipulate business leaders and politicians into advocating for policies that favor Beijing's long-term goals. Beyond trade, China also uses investment as a tool of influence. Over the years, Chinese investors have poured money into Taiwan's real estate, tourism industry, and financial markets. While this brings short-term economic benefits, it also gives Beijing greater control over Taiwan's economy. If Chinese companies own key assets in Taiwan, they can use their financial power to influence political decisions. For example, a real estate collapse triggered by sudden divestment from Chinese investors could create an economic crisis, forcing Taiwan's government to negotiate with Beijing to stabilize the situation. China has also leveraged economic pressure against Taiwan's allies. When countries or companies support Taiwan, Beijing often responds by cutting economic ties or imposing sanctions. For example, China has pressured international airlines to refer to Taiwan as a part of China on their websites or face being banned from operating in China. Similarly, countries that maintain diplomatic ties with Taiwan have been denied access to Chinese investment and trade deals. This sends a clear message to Taiwanese businesses and politicians. Opposing China comes with financial consequences. Another economic pressure point is Taiwan's reliance on China for labor and supply chains. Many Taiwanese businesses operate factories in mainland China, taking advantage of lower labor costs and well-established industrial infrastructure. If China were to restrict Taiwanese companies from operating in its territory, it could lead to mass job losses, factory closures, and economic instability in Taiwan. This would put immense pressure on Taiwanese leaders to cooperate with Beijing in order to prevent a financial crisis. China also controls key resources and supply chains that Taiwan depends on. For example, China dominates the global market for rare earth minerals, which are essential for Taiwan's high-tech industries, including semiconductor manufacturing. If Beijing were to restrict Taiwan's access to these critical materials, it could cripple Taiwan's economy. Additionally, China could place restrictions on Taiwanese agricultural and fishing exports, further tightening its grip on Taiwan's economic stability. Tourism is another sector where China has demonstrated its ability to manipulate Taiwan's economy. In the past, Beijing has either encouraged or restricted Chinese tourists from visiting Taiwan, depending on the political situation. When relations are good, China allows millions of tourists to visit, boosting Taiwan's economy. But when tensions rise, China cuts off tourism, causing businesses in Taiwan's hospitality and retail sectors to suffer. This tactic is a reminder that Taiwan's economy is vulnerable to Beijing's decisions, reinforcing the idea that maintaining good relations with China is necessary for financial stability. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of Taiwan's economic dependence on China is its long-term psychological impact on Taiwanese society. If Taiwan's people and businesses come to see economic integration with China as inevitable, resistance to political unification may weaken. Business leaders, workers, and investors may start prioritizing economic security over national sovereignty, gradually shifting public opinion in favor of closer ties with Beijing. If the economic cost of resisting China becomes too high, even those who strongly support Taiwan's independence may be forced to reconsider their stance. China understands that military force alone cannot win the hearts and minds of the Taiwanese people. Instead, it has adopted a long-term strategy of cultural and media influence to gradually reshape Taiwan's identity, making the idea of unification seem more natural and acceptable over time. By controlling the narratives in entertainment, news, education, and even social interactions, Beijing aims to erode Taiwan's distinct national identity and replace it with a sense of shared history, culture, and destiny with mainland China. One of the most effective tools in China's strategy is media infiltration. Beijing has invested heavily in acquiring, influencing, or manipulating Taiwanese news organizations. Some Taiwanese media outlets receive direct funding from Chinese businesses with ties to the Communist Party, while others are pressured to adopt pro-Beijing narratives in order to maintain access to China's lucrative market. By controlling a significant portion of the news landscape, China can shape public discourse in Taiwan, downplaying the risks of unification and promoting the idea that closer ties with Beijing are beneficial. In addition to influencing traditional media, China has mastered social media manipulation to push its narratives into Taiwanese society. Thousands of pro-China accounts operate on Taiwanese social media platforms, spreading propaganda, false news, and messages designed to create doubt about Taiwan's independence. These efforts are often subtle, using emotionally charged stories or personal testimonials to make pro-China arguments appear more organic. Over time, this continuous exposure to Beijing's perspective can influence public sentiment, making resistance to unification seem like an extreme position rather than the mainstream view. Entertainment is another powerful weapon in China's soft power strategy. Chinese television dramas, movies, and music are widely consumed in Taiwan, providing Beijing with a direct channel to influence Taiwanese culture. Many of these entertainment products contain subtle or overt messages about Chinese nationalism, shared cultural heritage, and the inevitability of unification. By making pro-China narratives a normal part of everyday entertainment, Beijing seeks to make Taiwanese audiences more receptive to the idea of reunification. Beyond television and movies, China also exerts influence over Taiwan's publishing and academic industries. Beijing funds academic research, cultural exchanges, and publishing houses that promote a pro-China version of history. Certain textbooks in Taiwan have been edited to include more references to a shared Chinese heritage, subtly shifting perceptions of Taiwan's historical relationship with the mainland. If future generations of Taiwanese students grow up learning a version of history that emphasizes unity with China rather than separation, the psychological barriers to unification will gradually weaken. China also promotes language and cultural exchanges as a way to blur the distinction between Taiwanese and Chinese identities. Mandarin Chinese is already the dominant language in Taiwan, but Beijing encourages greater cultural integration through scholarships, student exchange programs, and joint artistic collaborations. Many young Taiwanese students and professionals are invited to study or work in China under generous government-sponsored programs. Once exposed to life on the mainland, some Taiwanese individuals may develop a more favorable view of China, seeing it as a modern, prosperous, and welcoming society rather than an authoritarian threat. Religious and spiritual influence is another subtle but important aspect of China's cultural strategy. Buddhism, Taoism, and other shared religious traditions create cultural ties between Taiwan and the mainland. Beijing has worked to strengthen these connections by funding religious institutions, temple exchanges, and joint festivals. By emphasizing shared spiritual and moral values, China can cultivate a sense of unity that transcends political differences. China also leverages economic incentives to promote pro-China cultural figures and influencers. Many Taiwanese celebrities, social media personalities, and business leaders who express support for unification are rewarded with lucrative opportunities in China. Those who criticize Beijing, on the other hand, often face boycotts, blacklisting, or financial losses. This creates a chilling effect, discouraging public figures in Taiwan from openly opposing unification while encouraging others to speak favorably about China. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of China's cultural influence strategy is its long-term, gradual approach. Unlike military threats, which can provoke resistance, cultural infiltration happens slowly and subtly. By shaping Taiwan's media, education, entertainment, and social environment, China can create a future where the idea of unification is no longer seen as a hostile takeover, but as a natural and beneficial reunion. Over time, if enough Taiwanese people begin to see themselves as part of a greater Chinese identity, resistance to unification could fade, making military force unnecessary. One of China's most effective long-term strategies to take Taiwan without firing a shot is to isolate it diplomatically, ensuring that the island has no strong international allies to turn to in times of crisis. By systematically pressuring countries, international organizations, and global corporations to sever ties with Taiwan, China aims to leave the island politically and economically vulnerable. If Taiwan reaches a point where it stands completely alone on the global stage, the people may feel they have no choice but to accept Beijing's terms for unification. At the heart of this strategy is China's diplomatic pressure campaign against countries that recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation. When the United Nations was restructured in 1971, Taiwan lost its seat as the legitimate representative of China, and since then, Beijing has worked aggressively to reduce the number of countries that recognize Taiwan as an independent state. Over the past few decades, China has used economic incentives, trade deals, and political coercion to convince countries to cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan in exchange for closer relations with Beijing. As of today, only a handful of small nations officially recognize Taiwan, and that number continues to shrink as China expands its influence. China also uses its economic power to pressure multinational corporations into treating Taiwan as part of China. Many global businesses, including airlines, technology firms, and luxury brands, have been forced to change the way they refer to Taiwan on their websites, labeling it as a province of China instead of an independent entity. If companies refuse to comply, they risk being banned from doing business in China, losing access to its massive consumer market. Over time, this erodes Taiwan's international legitimacy, making it increasingly difficult for the island to maintain its identity on the world stage. China's influence extends beyond individual countries and corporations. It also affects major international organizations. Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, WHO, or many other key global institutions because Beijing blocks its participation at every opportunity. Even during global health crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan was excluded from critical WHO discussions because of China's objections. This diplomatic exclusion makes it harder for Taiwan to coordinate with the global community, creating a sense of isolation that weakens its international standing. Another key aspect of China's diplomatic isolation strategy is its influence over regional alliances and security agreements. Taiwan has long relied on the United States and other democratic nations for security support, but China is actively working to weaken these alliances. Through trade deals, diplomatic engagements, and strategic partnerships, Beijing is building stronger relationships with Taiwan's potential allies, making it more difficult for them to openly support the island in case of a crisis. If China can successfully weaken Taiwan's external partnerships, the island may find itself in a position where no major power is willing to defend it. China also uses economic coercion as a diplomatic tool to isolate Taiwan. By leveraging its position as the world's second-largest economy, Beijing pressures countries and international institutions to avoid official interactions with Taiwanese leaders. For example, if a country invites Taiwan's president to an official event, China may respond by imposing trade restrictions, withdrawing investments, or cutting diplomatic ties. This forces many nations to choose between maintaining relations with Taiwan or accessing China's economic benefits, and in most cases, economic self-interest prevails. Additionally, China has been building alternative global institutions and agreements that exclude Taiwan entirely. Beijing has launched initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and other regional economic agreements designed to strengthen China's global influence while leaving Taiwan out of key trade and development discussions. As China expands its control over global economic structures, Taiwan's ability to participate in international affairs diminishes, further isolating the island. One of the most psychological aspects of diplomatic isolation is the effect it has on Taiwan's people. If Taiwanese citizens see their country losing international recognition, struggling to join global organizations, and being sidelined in important diplomatic discussions, they may begin to feel that resistance is futile.